Welcome back to Big Brave Business. I'm your host, Sarah K. Heater. Big Brave Business is a podcast where we challenge the status quo of traditional business practices. So if you're ready to challenge norms, rewrite the rules, and redefine what it means to lead with courage and integrity, then grab a notebook and let's dive in. Welcome back to Big Brave Business. I am here with another guest, and my guest today is Stephanie. Stephanie left their 9-to-5 in education to build a business that allowed them to write all day and thrive. Along the way, they discovered a passion for helping other entrepreneurs grow through trauma-informed marketing. In addition to providing SEO copywriting services, Stephanie and their spouse, Theo, run a Patreon community. Together, they share their education on ethical marketing, sales, and photography. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, this is so interesting. There's so many things that I want to dig into with you, but I want to first say, I think it's so interesting. I saw you post on Instagram about Patreon recently, and my wheels just started turning. And I was like, oh man, what could I be doing? So I just think that's such a cool addition to what you do, and especially to do that together with your partner. That is so fun.
Thank you. I think it's really fun. And I think it is very rewarding on a number of levels. One, it gives people who don't necessarily have money or reason to hire me for big projects access to me and to our pool of knowledge. And also, Theo, my spouse, is just a very, very different kind of entrepreneur, and their brain works very differently than mine does. And I just love collaborating with them and also giving people like these two versions of how neurodivergent people can do business. It's really fun. I love it.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because obviously Patreon goes really hand in hand with podcasting and YouTube content. And since what I do with PodFox for serving clients is helping with mostly audio only podcasts, but also in addition, YouTube. And of course, Patreon has been really common for YouTubers for a long time. But some of the highest earning Patreon people, what is that called when you own a Patreon? Because patrons are the people who buy your access, right?
The patrons are the ones who have access, and then I think we're called creators.
Okay, so the creators who have a Patreon community, some of the highest earning creators on Patreon are podcasters. And so I'm constantly talking about Patreon from a podcast perspective, but recently I've started participating as a patron with a couple of creators that I really like, that I want to be connected to. And it's actually just such a fun place. And I think I'm just feeling so disenfranchised by the standard, like especially Instagram. It just isn't, it's not fun for me lately, and I want to be connected to people. And I'm really liking Threads for the most part, and that's obviously linked to Instagram, so that's a reason to have Instagram, but it's just not really doing it for me anymore. And maybe it's just because it's the novelty of Patreon, but I don't know. Anyways, so I'm already like fascinated by you because of Patreon. Such an interesting business decision.
Thank you. Yeah, honestly, we haven't grown. We have plans to grow it, our audience and our membership more, but like speaking from someone who's been on the creator side and who has a membership to like multiple Patreon communities, like it is that direct access to the creator that feels so different than it feels like Instagram used to feel. Like back in 2011 or whatever. I don't even know if I had an Instagram in 2011. I didn't have a smartphone until 2013 or 2014. But that's how people talk about it. But like I have memberships I have a membership to the If Books Could Kill podcast, and I love watching like the creators' actual responses to people's real questions, and I love the special things that get posted for members that don't necessarily get posted to like Spotify or whatever. And I eat it up. I just think it's so much fun. And it's, again, a pretty financially accessible way for a lot of people to be in your orbit. And which I think is really smart, because we're at a time where a lot of people are wanting to make small investments before they go big. They want to test someone out before they actually make a big investment in their business. It's
Yeah.
just one of the shifts I think we're seeing in the business space in general.
And I love that because I think one of the biggest kind of hills that I continuously keep dying on is the lack of ethical pricing. And I think I feel really fatigued. I'm 5 years into my business, which is on one hand not a lot, and on the other hand, it's not brand new anymore. So I'm complete fatigue is the best word I can think of to describe it. I'm completely fatigued by thinking something's interesting, thinking something's cool, wanting to learn more about something, wanting to explore something, and then there's a 5-figure ticket attached to it. Like, I'm exhausted by that, and I think for me, I saw somebody post on Threads recently. I'm in my membership era, and they were saying, like, here are some of my favorite digital subscriptions that I'm a part of. And some of them were like community based, and some of them were like Canva templates or something like that, or social media
Mm-hmm.
templates or whatever it is. And I can relate from except for I'm not necessarily looking for the same thing they're looking for, but like you said, that direct personal access, that sense of community, that authenticity that comes from those spaces versus it feeling so, I don't know, inauthentic is the best way I can think to describe how I feel about social media these days. So I love that. I love that. So I guess it all ends up being very related, and that's not surprising because it's who we are as people, and that's why you do business the way that you do business, which includes Patreon. But also, one of the things that really stands out in that bio that we just trauma informed, and this was something I jumped on right away when I was like, yes, I want to talk to you because I can tell from the content that you put out there that we have some very similar and overlapping kind of core values in the way we approach things and the same kind of critiques of the way people do business in general and how we could do things better. And also, trauma informed is such a fucking buzzword right now that a lot of people are using who I wouldn't follow. And so
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by this. So, can we talk about this terminology of trauma informed and what does it mean to you and why do you think it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have like the nerdy answer and the big picture answer. And I think it makes sense to start with the big picture answer. So let's start with the big picture answer. I think trauma informed to me is a practice of centering your client's humanity and your humanity in your business practices. So whether that is marketing, sales processes, your actual services themselves, how you design your business systems with your own needs and your clients' needs in mind, all of that comes down to centering who we are as individual humans. For trauma informed, I would say like that big piece of centering our humanity and centering the humanity of the people we work with and understanding that it is a practice that we're always trying to learn and get better at. But I would also say that if somebody says they're trauma informed and human centered without understanding the history of trauma informed care and anti oppression practices, then they are really missing a big piece of it. So for me, when someone says they're trauma informed, I'm always looking if they're mentioning like really fundamental principles of trauma informed care. Are they talking about safety, trust, empowerment, collaboration, consent? And how do those things show up in their businesses? So to me, understanding that trauma is in trauma informed care and trauma informed business is about the nervous system, there's actual science involved, and it's not just about feeling good, right?
Mhm.
Because sometimes trauma informed care is really hard and it's not pretty. And running a trauma informed business isn't gonna make you float around like Gwyneth Paltrow. It's just, that's not what we're doing here. No shade to Gwyneth Paltrow, I guess. That's just not
I
what.
was wondering if there was shade actually. I just because I think I'm wondering as somebody who obviously cares about this very much and is looking for uh, the kind of, I guess I'll call them red flags, but even yellow flags for indicators of somebody using the terminology but not necessarily really truly being a safe person to throw those terms around and to attract people who are most vulnerable to being harmed by their lack of preparation, etc. I wonder, especially with, again, I'm going to say like nervous system talk felt really wildly novel to me 2 years ago.
Mhm.
Wow, that is so interesting and fascinating, and I can see these patterns in my own life and in my own body, and that, wow, this is really like life-changing work. And now everyone talks about it. And so I wonder, like, for somebody who that is really important to you and you feel really well versed in it and it's a big part of what you do and how you approach business, I'm curious if it feels good to see more people talking about it or if it feels worrisome and dangerous. Probably both, but like, where do you land in that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I certainly am wary of ever policing other people's use of these terms myself because I am not a mental health professional. I have a PhD in anthropology. This is not where I received my professional training originally. And I just think that there's a lot of white supremacy behind policing other people's presences online anyway.
Mhm.
But so I would say we're in a culture shift. And when we are shifting an entire culture and the language an entire culture uses, and in this case, I guess we could say entrepreneur culture, there are going to be a lot of people who are doing their best and haven't quite fully caught it yet. And I'm not going to say that I am at my endpoint in my journey because to me, it's again a practice, it's not a destination. And
Mhm.
I see a lot of people trying and I see a lot of people learning. And I would say that there are sometimes people who will latch onto things that they see as trending and then use it in a way that is not actually aligned with trauma informed care or human centered values. But I think that a lot of people are trying. I just hope that I see a lot of people trying, but I hope they'll seek out the education that will give them the tools they actually need to do this well. Because in trying to do trauma informed care, you can actually re traumatize people if you're not doing it correctly or carefully. And there are things like I was listening to Katie Kurtz's podcast the other day, and she does really good work on trauma informed care and trauma informed business. And she was talking about how people were doing ACEs studies and doing ACEs questionnaires. And if you're not familiar, it's adverse childhood effects, or excuse me, adverse childhood experiences. And so all these hospitals were doing these questionnaires to figure out if people had these terrible childhood experiences, but then not providing them with resources when people were realizing what they had experienced was considered trauma. And so I just think we as entrepreneurs aren't necessarily doing that, but also in the entrepreneur space, we see a history of people telling other people to like be vulnerable and forgive people who've been really toxic with you and like all of this stuff that's can be pretty dangerous. So I think to answer your question, both and.
Yeah. It sounds like your approach is in observing others is generally it's good that we're having these conversations. It's good that this is language that's becoming more standard, that we have a kind of general the general knowledge is increasing. And as people have more of the general knowledge, they don't necessarily know what to do with that
Yeah.
effectively, especially in how they're interacting or engaging with other people. But at least we now have some shared frames of reference, some shared language, some like general principles that are more established that the more that people already know that stuff, we can skip that. A couple of weeks ago, we had an episode that aired that we were talking about burnout. And I had started that conversation. If you haven't listened to it, I had started that conversation with, I don't want to talk about what is burnout, what does it look like. We've had that conversation 1,000 times, right? Let's go further than that, right? And so I think that talking about being trauma informed and talking about the nervous system and talking about those kind of concepts, the more that we talk about them to the extent that we've talked about the term burnout, the more we can jump to, let's talk about the more interesting aspects of it and the more layered, nuanced, complicated parts of it. So I really like the way that you started that approach of, it's not up to me to police how people are using it. And there are definite real concerns about, there is such a thing as misusing it, right? There is such a thing as
Absolutely.
misusing it. Yeah, I like that.
Absolutely. And I think that there's especially going to be, I think trauma informed approaches have the potential to challenge a lot of conventional approaches to entrepreneurial leadership and the Instagram entrepreneur coaches, etc., like the
Mhm.
big names we know. Trauma informed care has the potential to really upend and disrupt a lot of what they teach because trauma informed care was cultivated in these anti capitalist spaces. And really, if you really dig into it, forces us to put people over profits. And
Mhm.
that's really sound is easy to say, and it's harder to walk that walk.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think 2 things. One is there's a very real rejection of, I need profit, I want profit. I even as an individual, I could be listening to this and thinking, I don't want to sacrifice profit. If it does, it have to be between, yeah, so if you're not seeing the video, Stephanie is shaking their head saying, "Yeah, I don't want to either."
Yeah,
And I
no.
think that we can feel like it's either or. I have to have one or the other. And I think, especially as our kind of anti capitalism energy grows, and the more you learn, the harder it is to not be anti capitalist, I think. And if that feels overwhelming to you listening, please just take it step by step. You don't have to jump that
Truly.
far to labeling yourself that way, but I do. So I think that, and I'm building a business in
Yep.
capitalism, right? And it's complicated and it's hard. And I guess the first thing is, I just want to say, I want to acknowledge that. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting about this is this sort of impression, and maybe this is just my impression of how things have been and how it's changed, but I think I can make an assumption that this is true in society, that there's this assumption when we use a term like trauma informed care, that to me sounds like therapy, rehab, whatever. This is what people need to deal with their trauma and their shit so that they can come and just exist in common spaces that don't have to be trauma informed. And one thing that I think is really interesting in using the term like trauma informed care is, I do podcasting. That feels weird to call it care. And what you're really talking about in incorporating that into business practice is that you had a list, and I'd love for you to actually go back through that list again of like the things, because I know like consent and safety were on there, but I don't remember what the things were, because that actually influences the way we make decisions in our business and the way we approach things like our pricing, our offers, our communication, our hiring practices, our onboarding practices, our SOPs, the technology we use, the like all of the things that we are doing, all of the decisions that we make every day, and the way we interact with other people. And so it's incorporated into all of that. So anyways, can we go back to that
Yeah,
list?
I would love to
Tell
go
me
back
again.
yeah, I would love to go back to that list and also ground this in some really specific examples because I think that will be so meaningful to people who are new to this conversation to see that this is actually very grounded practice that can happen in like very small, easy changes in your business. So a lot of trauma informed care is really grounded in safety, trust, empowerment, collaboration, and consent. And that can look all kinds of ways. In my own business, I can give a few examples if you'd like. So, for example, when I'm on with consent, I ask for consent at every stage of the sales process. Every stage. I ask consent before I send a proposal. I ask consent before I really go into even describing the ins and outs of my service on a sales call. Like I ask consent for at every stage, and it makes people feel empowered to say, no, this isn't for me, or actually I have this other question, or yes, please. And more often than not, I have found that the more I ask for consent, the more people are excited to give it because people just want to feel not taken for granted and they want to feel like they're not being bulldozed.
Wow. I mean, yeah, I can totally see that. And I say wow, somebody listening might not think that's as mind-blowing as I do, but I totally think it's mind-blowing. I spend a lot of time in all the spaces that I take up talking about consent and the idea of consent and autonomy, and realizing, just listening to your couple of examples, all of the places where I can insert more opportunities for enthusiastic consent from all participating parties is really interesting. That's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And I am very lucky. My spouse is also very invested in trauma informed business, and we have designed sales processes together, and they've been really helpful in supporting me in designing a lot of these things and tweaking things as we go, because the market changes. Our processes have to change, but trauma informed lenses don't necessarily. But also giving people time and not demanding that people, or rather, one of the most important things we can do is trust that people know what's the right thing for them. And so I don't do objection handling, which is gonna make some sales coach just combust. But I don't do it. I don't do it. If someone says I'm out of their price range right now, I believe them. And more often than not, in my experience, those people who are I can't afford to work with you right now, but I really respect what you do. I'm like, awesome, let's stay in touch. Or I really feel like our values really align and I think we could work really well together. If you tell me your budget, maybe there's something I could do within that budget. It's not telling them that their budget is wrong, and it's not shaming them for having it. It's just saying maybe there's some other way we could work together that we haven't thought of yet.
Yes. I say this all the time, and I did not make it up. And honestly, I don't remember the first place I read it, so I can't attribute it, which feels bad. But your money goals are not your client's responsibility is like the mantra I have designed the way I do business around. And I did this before I'd heard it phrased that way, but it resonates so deeply with me, where I hear so many people talking about, there's so many layers to pricing, but and sales, but I hear so many people talking about, like you said, objection handling, or a lot of times people will be critical of, you turned down this coaching, but you spent X dollars on Amazon Prime Day. And that's not your decision to make. Or I've heard also a lot of people, before I started my business, there were a lot of these quote unquote inspirational stories of people like selling their cars to go see Tony Robbins live. Again, in the spirit of not judging people for how they spend their money, I won't judge you if that's what you chose to do. If that's what makes the most sense for you, you should be empowered to make that decision. However, insinuating that somebody who isn't in a position to do that doesn't want it badly enough is totally unfair.
It's
It's
unfair
totally unfair.
and it's ableist and
Yeah.
probably at the root sexist, because a lot of women or people who were identified as women at some point in their lives are like caretakers of children or family members. There's just a million
Yeah, there's a lot of layers to
There's
that.
a lot of
But I feel like that energy is the same energy of people criticizing their prospective clients for spending X dollars at Amazon Prime Day. And I also think that if you're actually, I'm assuming if you are, you're probably not listening to this podcast, but if someone is going to social media or whatever to blast their own prospective clients, that also already tells me a lot about what I need to know. Talking about creating a space of like safety and trust and empowerment, like you're not doing that if what you're doing is blasting prospects on social media. And it's easy to fall into, because I think when we hear other people do it, we can read something that resonates deeply of, oh, that's me. This person sees me. They see that what I say I want is XYZ transformation. And although I feel like I can't afford it, I'm still going on and buying a new Dyson vacuum on Amazon Prime Day. And oh man, I have my own internal shame or guilt. And so when I read that, it resonates with me. And that just changed my mindset. Now I can flip my mindset. And now that's changed maybe you can even go so far as that changed my relationship with money when I read somebody else say, it. So now I find myself repeating those things because that's how I was socialized. So if you are doing it or have ever done that kind of behavior on social media or in a sales call or something like that, I would say like you're taught to. You're taught to do it that way, but you can unlearn it.
Yeah, I would also say that I don't know how much a mind shift can be actually changed, or a mind, excuse me. I don't know how much a mindset can actually be changed by shame, because there is so much
Mm.
research that shows you can't really change someone's mind or change their heart with shame. And that is what so much of this marketing is about. This shame on you for buying stuff on Prime Day, shame on you for not mortgaging your house to come to my speaking engagement. It's built on shame. And this is really resonating with something I'm actually reading right now. I'm reading Unlearning Shame by Devin Price. And
Mm.
it is so good, and it's so powerful in terms of like really laying out why this approach doesn't work to making social change. And I would argue like same thing here. Like shaming someone into doing something isn't in the long term setting them up to have a healthy relationship with money or a healthy relationship with themselves. Or this is not a healthy power dynamic. If you're controlling people with shame, that's yucky.
And that really feeds into a lot of what you were saying about at the very beginning about going back to like white supremacy, and you didn't say this word, but and class warfare, and like it actually is all still feeding into those kind of broken systems which have led to me and you identifying as anti-capitalist. This whole system, this whole structure, this whole power dynamic, as you said, that's actually continuing to feed the beast, and it's keeping us essentially like where we are. So I'm curious for you personally if and you started going down this route, and I'm interested to hear other examples like how you use this approach when it comes to, and especially marketing, because that was like a big part of what you had like submitted before we got on the call, was to
Yeah.
talk about marketing. So how does this influence marketing? Obviously we talked about not shaming your prospects on social media, but how
Yeah.
what else does that look like?
I would say a really important piece with marketing and understanding what trauma informed marketing looks like is understanding pain points and the way we're traditionally thought to think about and use pain points. So, in traditional marketing, we are taught that we should figure out what our prospect problem is, what is causing them this pain, naming it, agitating it, and then saying, here's the solution. I am your solution, right? And on the surface, you're like, okay, like when you spell it out like that, it doesn't seem so bad. But when you really get down to it, you are manipulating someone's emotions to get them into a heightened emotional state in order to sell to them. And you don't need to do that to sell. You just don't. And so I believe in understanding what your prospects' concerns are and what they want and what they say they want. And I believe in selling the positives, the benefits, the good experience that you provide for your clients. You can focus on those things, the unique selling points, without making people sit with this pain that they already have. You don't have to tell the long story at the beginning of your email about how hard an experience your clients are having. They're already sitting with this. They don't need you to name it for 3 paragraphs before you get into the solution. And you also can say, this solution could work for you if this solution might not be the best fit for you if. And by the way, when you say, notice I say could or might instead of will or should or need, or we're not using prescriptive language here. We're giving people space to make choice and showing that we trust them to make that choice for themselves.
Mhm, mhm.
And when I say this might not work for you if, I've seen people do this, and it drives me when they go, this might not work for you if you don't want to make a lot of money. You know?
I was thinking that too, and you brought up this kind of style. I was like, I'm going to bring this up of why it bothers me, because people take this concept and then don't use it effectively. Yeah, this won't work for you if you're a person who isn't ready to take action. This won't work for you if you don't actually want to make money, as you
Yeah.
said. This won't work for you if you don't like working hard to get results. It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not hiring a
That's
personal
not deterring
trainer.
anyone.
Yeah, yeah. That for me, like what I say in this might not be a good fit for you if is like, for example, when my spouse and I run our course that we are hoping to relaunch this year called Sales Off Social, we'll say this might not be a good fit for you if you have more money than time and would rather outsource some of these things. Or with my web page optimization service, it's a small ticket service, but I'll be upfront. I can't optimize a web page that doesn't have copy on it. If you don't have words on your web page, I can't optimize it. So this is not a good fit for you if you don't have words on your web page, which a
Yeah.
lot of photographers don't.
Yeah. And
So
I think for me, that would look like mostly what we do is produce on traditional ongoing podcasts, like a weekly show or a semi-weekly show or a bi-weekly show. So that ongoing long-term traditional podcast like this one. And we do offer other kinds of podcast services, and there are other ways incorporating audio content into your marketing strategy can look. But a lot of people think, oh, I want to start a podcast. And a traditional podcast might not work for you if you have 7 ideas about podcast episodes, right? So one of the things that we really talk about in our sort of idea validation process is, can you come up with, just sit down in front of a sheet of paper and have 50 ideas pour out of you? If you can't, then either a traditional podcast is not a good fit, or we have to go back to the drawing board about what is your actual idea. A traditional podcast, or actually I would argue any kind of podcast, also may not be a good fit for you if you want to just have interesting conversations and see where they go and record them for everyone. And you aren't really sure what they're going to be about. They could be about all kinds of things, but you think like everyone will find you interesting. Honestly, like that, and that kind of sounds like I'm going to the point of, this won't work for you if you don't want to make money. But actually, there are so many people that I see in like Facebook groups and things like that that are like, I just have really interesting conversations and I would just like to record them. It's, you don't need to record it. You can just have interesting conversations and enjoy your socializing. That's not really what my podcast services are for. And not to say you can't start a podcast, you can do anything you want. It's a really low barrier to entry. Start the podcast, do your thing. But to get results, and especially if you're going to work with us at PodFox, you got to have more direction, right? And I can help you with that, but you got
yeah,
to have more direction, right?
yeah.
So I think, yeah, let's have some actual tangible, this is not for you if.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that also building in, that's where we as service providers too have an opportunity to build in different kinds of supports to work with people whose brains work differently.
Totally.
And I think that's part of trauma informed care in a business space, because we are constantly surrounded and bombarded with these messages that if you can't make business work like this neurotypical, thin, upper class white man could make it work for himself, then surely you're not trying hard enough, or surely there's something wrong with you. But really, it's just that that worked for him and his privileges and his brain and the privileges that come with that brain. And if we have an opportunity to incorporate all kinds of systems for people who think and learn and communicate differently. And am very blessed to have been a special education teacher. And I say blessed because like my students were awesome. And I taught in New Orleans and my kids were like, they were just so cool. They were so creative and expressive, and I just really enjoyed working with them, and I miss them sometimes. But
Oh,
I learned a lot from being in special education that I take into working in entrepreneurial spaces, because people who get special education services in school or should have gotten them in school often just, once you turn 18, that's it. Like suddenly you don't have help for your dyslexia and you're expected to navigate all the same forms and respond to all your service providers with these obnoxious
Yeah.
questionnaires. And I use questionnaires, but I also say, if you would rather have another Zoom call, we can do that. Or if you want to send me a Loom video responding to things or a voice memo, like you don't have to sit there and type all these things in. Or if you need more help forming this idea, I'll use sentence starters and I can structure these conversations in whatever way works best for you. And to me, that's trauma informed care too, because you're giving people a space to feel safe to be as they are.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because even just for the guest form for this podcast, one of the things that I really like about the platform fillout.com for those forms is that you can actually insert a voice memo option. And so I had heard this from the person who recommended it to me. I don't even remember who that was, but if you're listening, thank you, on Threads. And when I went to check it out, I actually saw that it was really easy to incorporate. And then you can put that in there of, hey, if this is easier for you to do it by voice than to write it out, just record the voice memo instead, and you can tell me the same information and I can go off of that. It's optional. You don't have to record the voice memo, but at least that gives like another method of submitting the information. And that's such an easy thing for me to incorporate. Another thing that's similar to what you're saying that's come up for me in my business is that until 2024, which is a recently revamped, I'm going to call it a sales call, although we don't really do a traditional sales call with PodFox. We do a 90-minute launch strategy session for anybody who wants to start a podcast. And I had been using the same strategy session, like outline, I guess, the same structure, the same really delivery method, everything since I started my business in 2019. And I really started noticing, of course, my delivery's gotten better and I've incorporated more like nuance as I get more experience. But I started noticing really that I needed some significant changes when I did more and more of these calls. And I started noticing there are some brains that don't operate well in a 90-minute completely verbal situation.
Yeah.
There need to be visual elements, there needs to be a clear agenda, they need to be able to follow along where we are on that agenda. We need to continuously check in and go back to that agenda. There are things that are so easy for me to incorporate that make it easier for other types of brains to be able to function well on that call and get the most out of it. So we just revamped the whole thing to make it a lot more visual, have a lot more visual aids, and consistently going back section by section. Let's go back to the agenda. And so we see this is the same list, and here's where we are right now on that list, and this is where we're going. Like you can still see, right? And so incorporating those kind of details is just so simple and can already just be a step forward. And I use these examples because I think if you're listening and you're thinking like, I want my business to be accessible, but it feels overwhelming. There's so many things. It's true. Like accommodating all people's brains and experiences, especially like from a trauma informed perspective and considering all of it, it's hard to do all of it perfectly. Nobody's doing all of it perfectly. So just the little like incremental changes that you can start incorporating and just do one at a time. And add an agenda to your sales call and already you've taken one massive step forward, right? Add metadata to your images and already like you're taking a step forward, right? There's just so many small incremental details that can end up adding up to be a really big change. So that would be like the reason why I think it's important to talk about those examples.
Yeah. And I think that what you pointed out too is so important, is that no one is doing it perfectly, because no one can do it all perfectly. Because when we're talking about trauma informed care and working with neurodivergent people, we can never account for everything everyone has experienced or everything everyone is bringing to the table. But what we can do is engage in best practices that help us mitigate harm and reduce the chance that we're going to re-traumatize someone or not provide them the accommodations that they need. That's, again, I think, a point where just remembering and reminding yourself as much as you need to that this is a practice and it's not about the destination. That's, I think, the best thing we can do for ourselves to give ourselves grace.
Yeah. Yeah, and I said on a recent episode, I think that part of the reason having these discussions is so important is we have to keep having the conversation to keep it top of mind because we're continuously making decisions in our businesses, right? We're making decisions about platforms, we're making decisions about delivery, we're making decisions every time we write an email about what language we include, right? And how we address that person or whether we even do it via email. There's so many different decisions that are made, micro decisions and macro decisions, right? That if we continue to have these conversations and keep this top of mind, then hopefully it will continue to influence making decisions the way that it's aligned with our core values and who we want to be and how we want to show up and how we want to lead. So I think that is one of the reasons why this is so important. So I mentioned earlier giving ourselves grace about our own shame of participating in some harmful business practices and marketing practices by saying that this is what we're taught to do. This is what we're socialized to do. You're literally taught to do this both directly by many prominent coaches and mentors, but you're also taught this from the time you're a tiny child just by exposure, right, to these practices. We're immersed in it all the time, every day. And some people who we really look up to, admire, and want to emulate are participating. And so we want to imitate what they're doing, either consciously or subconsciously. And then, of course, yes, directly taught. We're being directly taught to do things in a potentially harmful way. So, with that being acknowledged, how can we recognize when advice is bad advice?
Yeah, I think the more that you practice trauma informed and human centered business, the easier it's going to get. Because for me at this point, it's like pretty intuitive, but it's not because for everyone because it is in the air we breathe. And I think that it's really important for us to, when we get marketing advice, ask ourselves, is this telling us to be unnecessarily urgent? Is this encouraging us to be unkind? Or is this encouraging us to obfuscate or hide something, like not being very transparent about pricing or pushing someone to make a decision quickly before they like really feel like they know everything they need to know to make that decision? So I think that that intuitive voice will become stronger, but watching out for like unnecessary urgency, false scarcity, things like that. Just, and then also there's this, it's corny, but ask yourself if you would want someone to talk to the person you love most the way that you're talking to your prospective clients,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
This is also a thing that I say a lot, but so I probably have shared it on this podcast, but I just don't remember off the top of my head. But when I definitely have shared it on other people's podcasts when I was a guest, but I'm not sure if I shared it on here. I was going through a really bad breakup in my 20s and I was struggling with a lot of things. And one of those things was that I was unmarried, I'd never been married, and I was struggling with the question, what if I never get married? Slash the real question, which is, what if no one ever wants to marry me? There it is. That's the real thing. That's what's really going on, right at the heart of it. And when I was trying to self-soothe slash self-coach myself through
Mm-hmm.
it, I found myself thinking, what would my response be to someone I loved? What would I tell someone I loved? And in that moment, there was this instant realization of I was thinking of that as a person very separate from myself because I didn't classify myself as a person I love.
I remember you talking about this, and I don't know if it was like on Threads, but I remember this story. And now I'm trying to remember where I remember it from. But I'm glad that you're telling it here because I think it is so relevant. Because when we're thinking about trauma informed care and the way I phrased it, the reason I phrased it that way is because for a lot of us who find ourselves in this entrepreneur space, buying into a lot of this like very traditional marketing and sales advice, we don't love ourselves the most. you know?
Yeah. I think the shame is so deeply ingrained about all the ways we're not enough. And I've said this so many times on this podcast, but entrepreneurship brings out all of your deepest things,
Truly.
all of your deepest wounds and fears and insecurities and scars and really all of your trauma, all of your trauma.
Yeah.
Even if you didn't even know you had it, even if you aren't ready to call it trauma, even if so much about yourself, it's all going to come out in entrepreneurship in one way or another. You're going to deal with
Yes.
all of it. And I think that's where this is really relevant, is thinking about, and it's funny that you said think about somebody you love and would you want someone to talk to someone you love this way, because when I was fresh out of college, I was selling cell phones at Verizon because I couldn't get a job in my field because #millennial. And I
Why
so
I
I
went
was
to grad school.
I ultimately also did. So I was selling cell phones at Verizon, and I ended up really becoming like known for being somebody who could handle our most elderly customers, because I would always think when someone walked in the door of like my grandmother, and I would think about how salespeople would talk to my grandmother and what they might do or how they might take advantage of her. And so I would always handle those particular customers. I just would think of my grandmother and how would I want someone to help and support my grandmother in this situation. And so I got this reputation where the customers that other people did not want to take the time or have the patience to work with ended up being my like go-to customers. But yeah, I think sometimes if you have a specific person in mind that you would protect at all costs, let that be a guiding light, is such interesting advice. And then hopefully we can ultimately make that person you would protect at all costs become yourself.
Yes, and I think there's so much potential for that with trauma-informed business and trauma-informed care, and because our clients are only half the equation, we're the other half of the equation. We have to extend the same care we give our clients to ourselves, or it all falls apart. And that is something that I've had to really, that has been one of the most challenging pieces of it for me personally, as a recovering overachiever.
Yeah, wow, that's so interesting to think about. You're the other half of the equation, especially when we're thinking about a term like consent.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking about all of the things and the ways that clients approach things with service providers that could be handled in a way that incorporates more consent. And I feel strongly, I do not, this is anecdotal, but I feel strongly that if we foster relationships with clients and if we build opportunities to engage with clients and if we initiate, especially if we initiate the relationships we have with clients from like a consent driven perspective, then it is so much more likely that then gets reciprocated. And then we're all like learning and doing better because what we're being socialized to do in that, in the nature of that relationship, is consent driven. And I keep on coming back to consent because for some reason my brain is just having so much trouble processing that list. Can you tell me it one more time, but go slow?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So you'll get like slightly different sort of lists of principles of trauma informed care
Yeah.
depending on like where you're looking. But generally speaking, it's like safety, trust, empowerment, collaboration, and consent are five of the big ones.
And I think when you care about approaching people in a human first way, this kind of comes naturally. So I'm reflecting on some of the things that I've done before I necessarily had any kind of framework or had any discussions like this. And I just knew this is how I want to operate. And I've always said on this podcast with Amanda, even in season 1, spend less time in places that make you feel like shit and with people who make you feel like shit. And I think really, like at the heart of it, this is going to solve a lot of these. And what I'm trying to get at with that advice is listen to your intuition and how things make you feel. And if you can get in touch with what your body is telling you and what your brain, the warning signs your brain tells you when something doesn't feel right, instead of trying to say, I must not want it badly enough, or it must be that like I need some culture shock, some shock therapy of putting myself in this situation that feels bad so I can get used to it and then I can be better. Instead of doing that, listen, why is my body indicating that this is a shock? Why is my body indicating to me? Why is my brain indicating to me that this is not good, then if you can, totally remove yourself from that factor so that once you're removed from it, you can have a better idea of what is actually going on here. There are things that feel bad that we have to do, right? We have to pay taxes, we have to go to the dentist, we have whatever. Those are my go-to examples because they're two things that, like, generally speaking, don't feel good to do, but we
They
have to
feel
do them.
terrible.
There are some things that you can remove yourself from and realize here's the reasons why that is a good thing and I do need to do it. But then there are things that once you're removed from, you can be like, oh, now I can process this. Removing, saying, stop spending time in places that make you feel like shit or with people that make you feel like shit, to me really comes back around to the same thing of there are some things about it that come naturally. Putting people first. If you're
Mhm.
like an empathetic person and you are not a diagnosable sociopath, that which is a real thing,
Yeah.
if you're a diagnosable sociopath, you're going to have more trouble with this, which there are resources available for that. But if you're not a diagnosable sociopath, then some of this stuff is going to come naturally when you think about what it means to put people first in your decision making for your business leadership. Then some of it's going to come naturally. But when we have conversations about framework and things to be like really mindful of, we can make more informed decisions and more intentional decisions. And I think that's really beneficial. So I'm so interested too, because now that last time you went through them, like, collaboration really jumped out at me. I don't even think I heard that when you were talking about it before. So I'm just like fascinated. Like, this is just so interesting to me. And I just think like each one of these individually I could spend time going in on. But I'm looking at the time and let's move into the final question that I always like to ask everyone. And this can be business related, but it does not have to be. What is something that is making you happy these days?
Oh, gardening.
Wow, okay. That
Gardening.
was a fast answer. You're
I
like,
I have been really into my garden lately. I've been really into my plants. So we moved to the Philadelphia area from New Orleans last year. So it is just I've finally seen like a full year of seasons for the first time since 9 because I lived in Phoenix and then
"Oh,
I
okay,
lived yeah, I went to grad school at ASU and then I lived
okay." I skipped right over that when we were talking about me having been from Pennsylvania. I, like, did not even wow,
Sun Devil.
okay.
Yeah, so I
Fascinating.
just hadn't been around like a full 4 seasons in a really long time,
Yeah.
and it's been really exciting to get to know all these new little lives and little beings living around us and growing vegetables we weren't able to grow, and we're learning a lot about permaculture and thinking about how we're gonna, like, really intentionally landscape our front yard to be like a food forest. But this is what's bringing me joy. Yeah.
Wow, okay. So cool. I always say I have a black thumb, like, meaning I kill every plant. Like, I just yeah, think it's not for me, but I wish that I had the ability to really nurture a garden because I think that a garden is beautiful, just point blank. Like, I grew up in Pennsylvania, which we talked about before I started recording, and my mom was not like a major gardener, but she definitely liked gardening, and we always had a garden.
Yeah,
And sometimes I would go with her to pick like what we were gonna plant in a specific season or year or whatever. But I somehow I did not inherit the gardening gene. I don't know. But part of it definitely with a true garden is yes, I live in Phoenix. There's not a lot of gardening to be done, but even just a house plant, like I cannot keep a house plant alive. So that is fascinating and fun. What a fun new kind of thing to just be able to learn an endless amount about. Like the learning is never done, which I feel like
yeah,
seems like your personality. So that seems like
yeah,
that would be a reason to love it, and also just the nurturing and growth of things, like, point blank, like, that's interesting.
yeah. It's
Cool,
also like a
cool.
very collaborative effort in our family because my
Yeah.
parents live with us, and my dad's a huge gardener, and his family has been into like farming and gardening for like many generations back. And Theo, my spouse, has a degree in from a forestry college, so and grew up landscaping and everything. So we're all involved and getting our kiddo involved. So it's also just, I guess, part of it is just like the family time is also really nice.
Wow,
Yeah.
yeah. That's so cool. Okay, something that's making me happy right now is that my business is in a season of growth, and it's such a good feeling because I feel like during the holiday season, my business really went into, and I know a lot of people experience this, went
Mm.
into a plateau. And it was in a good place, thankfully, when I went into the plateau. So that was honestly fine.
Mhm.
But, and I just put my head down and did the work, knowing it ultimately is going to pay off. Like it's going, seasons are normal. The roller coaster of entrepreneurship and of business in general is normal. And you just keep pushing forward, knowing that there is another season coming and it's okay, and do good work and get good results. And I've been really focused in 2024 on like new ways to collaborate with people, which I
Mhm.
think is part of the reason why when that last time that you went through your list, why collaborate really, oh, that's so interesting. That's been such a focus for me this year, is finding ways to be truly collaborative. And the more people I meet and the more conversations I have that are really interesting, meaningful conversations, not just in the context of this podcast, but that counts, the more opportunities are becoming available to me. And this just feels like a season of validation, a season of yes, a season of growth. Of course, obviously, more clients, more projects. That's happy and exciting. But also, of course, I'm not trying to say, oh, it's just new clients. No, that's great. I'm so happy about that. And I know how anybody listening who is either in sales or runs their own business and does any kind of client work, like it feels great to have new clients. That's wonderful. And also like some bigger conversations, some bigger opportunities that just feel like I'm just feel so validated and sure that the direction this business is going is just so exciting and fun. And yeah, that's making me really happy right now.
Well, congrats. I'm really happy for you. That's very
Thank you.
exciting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And thank you for being here and joining me for this conversation. I just feel like there's a million directions we could go. I feel like every single one of those things that you referred to as kind of principles of trauma informed, we could have entire podcast conversations about each of them. And as you mentioned, that's the specific like kind of framework or list you came with, but there's other sources that might have other kind of principles. So yeah, really endless content about this, but I think that this was a fun, that feels weird to say about trauma. It was, but it was a meaningful conversation. And I just think like thinking about business in terms of being human centric feels good and it feels fun and it feels validating and reassuring that like we can do things differently and we can do things better. And when you do things like you really can just operate in a place where you just do things that feel good as far as how you treat other humans and how other humans treat you. Like we really can just build, that's wild and fun. Yeah. So thank you for being here and for diving into kind of the beginning of that with me. Again, I say beginning because there's just so much more to talk about. And to you listening, thank you for hanging in there with me and with us for this conversation and for all the conversations. And I hope you'll be back next week. We'll have another great, interesting conversation. And definitely, Stephanie, would love to have you back. We can talk about so many more things. And
I would love that.
also, all of our information to connect with both of us is going to be in the show notes. So definitely please come connect with us. Check out Stephanie and Theo's Patreon. Check out their other kind of websites and platforms to connect with them. But definitely Patreon. That seems like a no-brainer. And also my links to connect with me are also in the description as well. And we'll see you next week.